Following last tutorial about the vertebro-basilar system, this time we're going to have a look at the carotid system. The carotid system arises out of the internal carotid artery, which is bifurcated from the common carotid artery. I drew it over here. Common carotid artery bifurcates into the external carotid artery and internal carotid artery. At the base of internal carotid artery and at the top of the common carotid artery before it bifurcates resides a dilated area called carotid sinus. This carotid sinus contains baroreceptors, pressure receptors that detects the change in the blood pressure. It constantly monitors our blood pressure and it sends a signal to a nucleus in the brainstem to regulate our blood pressure. This carotid sinus is at the level around the Adam's apple. In more technical term, the Adam's apple is called laryngeal prominence. So at the level of the laryngeal prominence, the carotid sinus exists, and around the level is where the common carotid artery bifurcation happens. And the important part here, obviously, for the study of the blood supply to the brain is internal carotid artery. The carotid sinus contains, like I said, baroreceptors for detecting blood pressure, and it sends signal to the brainstem. So if you have a look at the picture on the bottom, the carotid sinus sends signal to medulla part of the brainstem, and specifically it interacts with cell bodies called nucleus tractus solitarius or solitary nucleus. Nucleus tractus solitarius sends signal in two ways. It can send signal to parasympathetic nervous system and sympathetic nervous system. So depending on the need, it'll modulate either of them and change the blood pressure. And the change in blood pressure will feed back to the baroreceptors of the carotid sinus. Let me just write that down too, over here. It sends that signal from the carotid sinus through glossopharyngeal nerve, the cranial nerve 9. And from the nucleus tractus solitarius, it sends signal via sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system comes out of lateral gray horn of our spinal cord, and it synapses with either prevertebral ganglion or paravertebral ganglion. In case of heart, the paravertebral ganglion is synapsed with, which resides close to the spinal cord, and it branches from the paravertebral ganglion to the heart via postganglionic neuron. Just one more thing about the sympathetic nervous system is the preganglionic neurons start from the lateral gray horn of T1 to L2 or 3. The sympathetic nervous system, like I said, is modulated, and parasympathetic nervous system is also modulated by the nucleus tractus solitarius. In this case, for the heart, vagus nerve is modulated. So I'll draw a little heart here with 4 chambers. So in case of drop in blood pressure, the signal from the carotid sinus is weak, and the weak signal to the nucleus tractus solitarius excites the sympathetic outflow and reduces parasympathetic outflow. And in this case, the parasympathetic outflow is through vagus nerve, the cranial nerve 10. So it increases the blood pressure by increasing the stroke volume and heart rate. Hence, for example, if we suddenly stand up from lying down, there is blood pooling to our lower limb and abdomen and drop in blood pressure and blood flow to our brain and upper body. The increase in sympathetic outflow to the heart and blood vessels increases the blood flow back to our brain by increasing stroke volume and the heart rate, and also the sympathetic vasoconstriction of our blood vessels in lower limbs, so there's more blood flow towards the heart. And from the heart, with the increase in stroke volume and heart rate, increases the blood flow towards the carotid sinus and back to the brain. Contrarily, if there's increase in blood pressure suddenly, then the glossopharyngeal nerve sends signal to the nucleus tractus solitarius that there's increase in blood pressure. So the nucleus tractus solitarius tones down the sympathetic outflow and increases parasympathetic outflow through vagus nerve. Vagus nerve through parasympathetic activity reduces the cardiac output, so reduces the stroke volume and heart rate, and it relaxes our blood vessels so as to reduce the cardiac output towards the heart and ultimately towards the brain. So moving on, from internal carotid artery, it continues to rise and it arrives at the base of the skull. So the place that I'm interested in this picture is over here, and this represents the area called foramen lacerum, and through here the internal carotid artery enters the cranial cavity. So if I say around this area is foramen lacerum, internal carotid artery rises, enters carotid canal, and exits via foramen lacerum. And that carotid canal is right here, and it creates a little tunnel towards the foramen lacerum. So the internal carotid artery rises, enters carotid canal, and through the carotid canal and exits out of foramen lacerum and enters the cranial cavity. Once it enters the cranial cavity through foramen lacerum, the internal carotid artery meets and pierces a dural venous sinus called cavernous sinus. It's a pool of venous blood in a sac, so it looks kind of like this, a pool of venous blood. The cavernous sinus resides on both sides, right next to where the pituitary gland sits. Pituitary gland sits in this region called sella turcica. It's hard to see from this picture, but this place has a little indentation like here. So that's the sella turcica where the pituitary gland sits. And that region is over here. Just to name a few structures around it, this is clinoid process, a little sharp edge. This is dorsum sellae, and this is tuberculum sellae. The posterior wall of the sella turcica is called dorsum sellae, and the anterior wall of the sella turcica is called tuberculum sellae. So the internal carotid artery rises out of the foramen lacerum. It pierces through the cavernous sinus. As a matter of fact, it is the only dural venous sinus that allows an artery to pierce through. And once the internal carotid artery pierces through the cavernous sinus, it then enters the meninges. It pierces dura mater, then it pierces arachnoid mater, and it enters the subarachnoid space. Just as a review, from the last tutorial, I mentioned that vertebral basilar system enters the subarachnoid space once it enters the foramen magnum, let's say around this region. So going back here, internal carotid artery enters through carotid canal and exits to enter the cranial cavity through foramen lacerum, goes through cavernous sinus, enters subarachnoid space where there is cerebral spinal fluid, and it branches into few different parts. Now imagine there is a orbital cavity where our eyes sit. To reach the orbital cavity, there are two holes that link the orbital cavity to the cranial cavity. One is optic canal and the other one is superior orbital fissure. And let me show you that. This over here is optic canal and this over here is superior orbital fissure. And roughly around this area is the orbital cavity. So there's a link and there's a link. Through this optic canal, optic nerve and ophthalmic artery passes. Optic nerve and ophthalmic artery. So going back, once the internal carotid artery comes out of the cavernous sinus, it comes out, enters the optic canal. On the way, the ophthalmic artery branches out into several different blood vessels, such as posterior ethmoidal artery, anterior ethmoidal artery, together which supplies the tissues inside the nasal cavity and nasal septum. The ophthalmic artery branches into central retinal artery, which supplies the retina, anterior ciliary artery, which supplies the ciliary body, the conjunctiva and sclera, lacrimal artery, which supplies the lacrimal gland, supraorbital artery, and supratrochlear artery, which supplies the muscles, the skin, and the tissues around the forehead and eyelid. And it all branches from the ophthalmic artery. The second branching from the internal carotid artery I want to mention is posterior communicating artery. And the posterior communicating artery is the one that completes the circle of Willis. Vertebral artery merges at the medulla, rises up at pons, and it branches out into posterior cerebral artery at the level of midbrain, just above the oculomotor nerve. The posterior communicating artery links the anterior system to the posterior system, and there's anterior cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery, and there is anterior communicating artery. And like I mentioned, the posterior communicating arteries are the one that links the carotid system, the anterior system, to the posterior system. The internal carotid artery branches backwards and it gives rise to that posterior communicating artery. And it also gives rise to anterior choroidal artery. Anterior choroidal artery supplies blood to the choroid plexus of lateral ventricles and third ventricle. Choroid plexus's function is to produce cerebral spinal fluid via ependymal cells. Choroid plexus also separates the blood from the cerebral spinal fluid. So as I mentioned before, this is the optic canal and this is the superior orbital fissure, both of which links towards the orbital cavity. Below this little hole is foramen rotundum, and this one is foramen ovale. This one over here is foramen lacerum, where the internal carotid artery emerged. And this one over here is internal acoustic meatus. Meatus meaning canal. This over here is jugular foramen. And this one over here is hypoglossal canal. And this over here is foramen magnum. And here is small perforations called cribriform plate. Through this region lies the cranial nerve 1, olfactory nerve. Through here, the optic nerve lies, like I mentioned over here, along with the ophthalmic artery. And optic nerve is cranial nerve 2. Through superior orbital fissure lies the cranial nerve 3, 4, 5, and 6. So the oculomotor, trochlear, ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve and abducens nerve. So if you imagine brainstem sitting over here, it branches out into that area. Like I mentioned though, about here on the side of the sella turcica lies the cavernous sinus. Right after internal carotid artery exits the foramen lacerum and comes out, it meets with the cavernous sinus right on the sides of the sella turcica. And as this nerves to our eyes gets there, it also passes through the cavernous sinus. Abducens nerve traverses the cavernous sinus, so it goes right through, it pierces it. But all the other cranial nerve that moves towards the superior orbital fissure lies on the edge, outer layer of the cavernous sinus. Oculomotor nerve, trochlear nerve, and ophthalmic branch of the trigeminal nerve lies on the outside layer of the cavernous sinus. And these three goes in towards the superior orbital fissure and exits towards the orbital cavity. Foramen rotundum contains the maxillary branch of the trigeminal nerve, and the foramen ovale houses the passage of the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve. It's quite easy to remember because starting from the top, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and within the 5, 1, 2, 3 comes out from anterior to posterior sequence, and 6 in the superior orbital fissure, the abducens nerve. Foramen lacerum houses the internal carotid artery, and this foramen lacerum itself is very unique in that it is created by the combination of 3 different bones: the sphenoid on top, and basilar part of the occipital bone, and the petrous part of the temporal bone. Petrous meaning the rock. So it's a whole made by 3 different cranial bones. Right behind it is internal acoustic meatus, and through here, last time we mentioned that the labyrinthine artery went through to supply the vestibules and cochlear, and along with it lied the facial nerve, the cranial nerve 7, and vestibulocochlear nerve, the cranial nerve 8. And behind it lies quite a large hole, jugular foramen, and it houses the passage of the cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal nerve, the cranial nerve 10, vagus nerve, and the cranial nerve 11, accessory nerve. And it was relevant right here, wasn't it? The vagus nerve and the glossopharyngeal nerve reached the brainstem, and is doing so through the jugular foramen. And lastly, the hypoglossal canal houses the passage of the hypoglossal nerve, the 12th cranial nerve. If you were to have a look at it from this view, from the bottom of the brain, that sits on top of the cranial cavity. The olfactory nerve, the optic nerve, the oculomotor nerve, trochlear nerve. Now the interesting thing about the trochlear nerve is that this is the only cranial nerve that emerges from behind the brainstem when all the other cranial nerve comes out from the front. Trigeminal nerve, the biggest cranial nerve, so the ophthalmic branch, maxillary branch, and mandibular branch, and it comes out at the pons. In between the pontomedullary junction, so this is the, below it is medulla, and this is pons, starts the 6th cranial nerve, abducens nerve, medially, and then going laterally, facial nerve, which divides into motor and sensory, which is not drawn over here, and more laterally to the facial nerve is the vestibulocochlear nerve, and coming down right behind the olive. So this is a pyramid, this heart-shaped middle portion of the medulla, and lateral to it is olives. Right behind that olives starts the glossopharyngeal nerve. Underneath it, vagus nerve, and underneath it again lies the accessory nerve coming down the spinal column to the C5. Between the pyramids and olives lies the last cranial nerve, the hypoglossal nerve. So this is really beautiful how it's arranged in an order, from 1 coming down, from medially to laterally, front to back, from top to bottom, 1 to 11, and medially to 12. After that, the internal carotid artery gives rise to anterior cerebral artery and middle cerebral artery. Anterior cerebral artery goes around the corpus callosum, which is the white matter that links the left and right hemispheres. So let's say around this area lies the corpus callosum, and right above it, the anterior cerebral artery curls around from the medial view, and then from medial to superior and laterally makes branches outwards and supplies the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. As we learned from last video, the occipital lobe is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery, and the middle cerebral artery supplies the temporal lobe, parts of frontal lobe, parietal lobe, and little portion of anterior inferior part of occipital lobe. If you look at it from this view, the anterior cerebral artery make a round run, and it supplies the arteries this way. The middle cerebral artery, on the other hand, supplies our artery through this way. So the middle cerebral artery supplies that area, and anterior cerebral artery supplies that area. Therefore, if someone had a stroke at the anterior cerebral artery, it affects the lower limb and trunk contralaterally, because the corticospinal tract decussates at medulla, and the majority, about 90% of the corticospinal tract decussates, whereas only 10% passes down ipsilaterally. If the middle cerebral artery has an occlusion, and therefore a patient suffers ischemic stroke, it affects upper limb from shoulder to the hand and the face. The middle cerebral artery also supplies the deep tissues such as basal ganglia and white matter such as internal capsule. So just to lay out the components of basal ganglia: globus pallidus, which is called pallius striatum, the putamen and caudate, together which is called the neostriatum, nucleus accumbens and olfactory tubercle, together which is called ventral striatum or anterior striatum, and substantia nigra and subthalamus. And these deeper structures of the brain are supplied by middle cerebral artery. Middle cerebral artery, considering this is a brain, central sulcus and lateral sulcus. Lateral sulcus is the fold that divides frontal and parietal lobe to temporal lobe. And in between the fold passes middle cerebral artery, comes out, and it fans out around to supply the central portion of the brain. So as the middle cerebral artery passes from medial to laterally, it gives branches towards the deep structures of the brain, and this branch is called central branch or lenticulostriatal artery. So middle cerebral artery, after it passes along the lateral sulcus, it gives lenticulostriatal artery, and it comes out on the surface and it supplies all the important blood supply to the cortices. Just one more thing I think would be good to know is the areas of the brain and the folds. So I'm going to draw brain, the middle over here. I'm going to erase this and draw brain. So consider this as a brain. The front side is the frontal lobe. The superior and posterior part is parietal lobe, occipital lobe at the back, and temporal lobe, auditory, memory function mostly, executive function at the frontal lobe, and language center at the Wernicke's and Broca center. Wernicke's at the junction between parietal lobe and temporal lobe, and Broca's area where there is language syntax process happening at the frontal lobe. Important landmarks are the central sulcus, right between the frontal lobe and parietal lobe. This is the gap that separates the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe. And there is precentral sulcus and postcentral sulcus. There is superior frontal sulcus and inferior central sulcus. There is superior temporal sulcus, inferior temporal sulcus. See, there's a pattern to it. Intraparietal sulcus, parieto-occipital sulcus, intra-occipital sulcus, and inferior occipital sulcus. Each sulcus has a specific function of dividing functional and anatomical areas of the brain. And this part is called superior frontal gyrus. This is middle frontal gyrus. This is inferior frontal gyrus. This is precentral gyrus, where the motor cortex happens right here. This is postcentral gyrus, the sensory area. Superior parietal lobule, inferior parietal lobule, and the parietal occipital sulcus divides the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. In the occipital lobe, intra-occipital sulcus divides the superior occipital gyrus with the middle occipital gyrus, and inferior occipital sulcus divides the superior and middle occipital gyri to inferior occipital gyrus. In the temporal lobe, this area is superior temporal gyrus, this is middle temporal gyrus, and this is inferior temporal gyrus. Some other important landmarks are these two regions, the supramarginal gyrus and angular gyrus. At the lateral sulcus, anterior horizontal ramus and anterior ascending ramus branches out. So anterior horizontal ramus and anterior ascending ramus. The front part created by the anterior horizontal ramus is pars orbitalis. Right behind is pars triangularis, and behind it is pars opercularis. So these are the overview of the blood supply and some landmarks of the brain.